Petyr Baelish's commonly used nickname, Littlefinger, sounds pretty obscure at first. Like, why would a grown man refer to himself as a pinky? But it's explained very early into the story when Catelyn Stark is sneaking her way into King's Landing. But, my lady, the moment we go ashore we are at risk, and there are those at court who will know you on sight. Catelyn's mouth grew tight. Littlefinger, she murmured. His face swam up before her, a boy's face, though he was a boy no longer. His father had died several years before, so he was Lord Baelish now, yet still they called him Littlefinger. Her brother Edmure had given him that name long ago at Riverrun. His family's modest holdings were on the smallest of the fingers, and Petyr had been slight and short for his age, so a double meaning for his epithet. The obvious one making a mockery of his small size, but the other meaning stemming from House Baelish's seat. On the northeastern tip of the Vale, the kingdom where House Arryn rules, there are 5 narrow peninsulas. They're called the Fingers since they kind of form the shape of a hand. The smallest finger, or peninsula, is where House Baelish made their home. Petyr's great-grandfather was from Braavos, so not too far from the Vale. He was a sellsword who sailed here under the employment of House Corbray. House Corbray is one of the more ancient families of the Vale, and their seat isn't too far off from the Fingers. This Braavosi sellsword's son would become a hedge knight and take upon the Titan's head as House Baelish's sigil. The sigil representing the oversized statue that protects the entrance to Braavos. This hedge knight's son would be Petyr's father. The Baelish family didn't have any lands or titles up until this point, but Petyr's father was able to carve out a little piece of undesirable land for himself and elevate his family to nobility. He owned a few stony acres and presided over a village with a dozen families. He was able to employ some servants and guards, but their home wasn't very luxurious. House Baelish's seat is an unnamed tower that has 3 floors. There aren't even any windows, though there are some arrow slits for defending their home. It may be right by the narrow sea, but it isn't a safe location to anchor any ships. Petyr, being a very accomplished man, looks down upon his family home, calling it the Drear Fort. His father was the smallest of lords, but even that is something to be proud of. Each generation of Baelish has made incremental moves up society's ladder, but Petyr would fly to the top. Petyr's father, the first Lord Baelish, participated in the War of the Ninepenny Kings, 40 years before the start of the story. It was a quick and easy war that attempted to take the Iron Throne away from the Targaryens, that ended in such a big failure that the opposition didn't even reach Westeros. Petyr's father, I know it's getting old just calling him that, but his name is never mentioned, happened to befriend Lord Hoster Tully, Catelyn, Lysa, and Edmure's father, who ruled over the entire kingdom of the Riverlands, as Lord Paramount of the Trident. This friendship led to Petyr being sent to House Tully's castle, Riverrun, to be fostered by Lord Hoster Tully himself. A huge deal since this is usually only done between families of equal strength, like the time Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon were sent to the Vale to be fostered by Lord Jon Arryn. Like marriage, this is a way for families to build alliances in this world. We don't know who his mother is, probably because she isn't anyone of significance, but Petyr was born in 268 AC. It was during these early years at Riverrun that Edmure would come up with the name Littlefinger. Edmure has been portrayed to be foolish and incompetent throughout the series, but I think this double entendre of a nickname was pretty clever. Petyr grew close with the Tully kids, and while his 3 foster siblings were never exceptional at anything, Petyr did stand out. No shade towards the Tullys, but they clearly didn't take after their badass uncle Brendan Tully, the Blackfish. Catelyn is dutiful, but extremely irrational when it comes to her family. Lysa is a nutcase, and I already went through Edmure's faults. Petyr, on the other hand, was sly, clever, and bold, traits he wouldn't grow out of. He learned how to manipulate others by showing guilt after getting caught in his mischief. Petyr was close enough with the Tullys that he traveled with Hoster and felt comfortable enough to go to Brendan Tully with whatever was troubling him. He would play kissing games with Cat and Lysa, and eventually harbor feelings for Catelyn that would turn into love. She didn't share these feelings, however, only seeing him as her little brother, who Cat always looked down on. Literally, she would always be taller than Littlefinger, even in adulthood. Everyone underestimated him because of his low birth and unimpressive physical stature, all except for Tyrion. He knew Petyr was dangerous. Cat just knew he could not be fully trusted. It would be Lysa that would fall in love with him instead, but he never cared for her, only having eyes for Catelyn. And then it was time for Hoster to make marriage betrothals for his children. This usually is the job for the lady of the house, but Hoster's wife and the Tully children's mother died in childbirth. When Cat was only 12, Hoster found a great match in House Stark. Lord Rickard Stark, who also lost his wife, was looking to align his house with the more southern kingdoms, since the Starks historically married within the north, which was never really advantageous for them, since they already are their bannermen. But a marriage between another kingdom, like the rulers of the Riverlands, would make for a strong ally. Lord Rickard's eldest son and heir, Brandon, who was a couple years older than Cat, would marry her when she was of age. The dutiful Cat thanked her father for making a great match, but Petyr was crushed. This meant Cat would leave Riverrun to live the rest of her life in the north with another man. The night the betrothal was announced, Petyr danced with Catelyn and even tried to kiss her. She pushed his advancements away and laughed them off, worsening his broken heart. This next part is a little confusing, since going by the timeline, Petyr should have been just under 10 years old. George Martin writes that he got drunk and passed out on the table and was carried off to his bed by Brendan Tully. Lysa snuck into his bed, the drunken Petyr believing it was Cat and made love with her. Children in primitive settings start young, I guess. It would be years later for the marriage to have an official date. Brendan traveled down south to Riverrun, where the wedding would take place. At this point in the story, Petyr was 15 and Brandon was 20. The young and foolish Petyr believed his only chance to win Cat over was to defeat Brandon in a duel. Not only was the heir to Winterfell 5 years his senior, but he was built like a warrior. Ned Stark is considered to be a fairly tall man, standing over 6 feet tall, but his older brother Brandon even towered over him. He was a very skilled fighter who grew excited over battle or jousts. This was the wrong person to challenge to a duel. Brandon happily accepted. This is what he lived for. They met in the lower Bailey of Riverrun. When Brandon saw that Petyr wore only a helm and breastplate in mail, he took off most of his armor. Petyr had begged her for her favor he might wear, but she had turned him away. Her lord father promised her to Brandon Stark, and so it was to him that she gave her token. A pale blue handscarf she had embroidered with the leaping trout of Riverrun. As she pressed it into his hand, she pleaded with him. He is only a foolish boy, but I loved him like a brother. It would grieve me to see him die. And her betrothed looked at her with the cool grey eyes of a Stark and promised to spare the boy who loved her. The fight was over almost as it begun. Brandon was a man grown, and he drove Littlefinger all the way across the Bailey and down the water stair, raining steel on him with every step, until the boy was staggering and bleeding from a dozen wounds. Yield, he called, more than once, but Petyr would only shake his head and fight on, grimly. When the river was lapping at their ankles, Brandon finally ended it with a brutal backhand cut that bit through Petyr's rings and leather into the soft flesh below the ribs, so deep that Catelyn was certain that the wound was mortal. He looked at her as he fell and murmured, "Cat," as the bright blood came flowing out between his mailed fingers. She thought she had forgotten that. That was the last time she had seen his face, until the day she was brought before him in King's Landing. Petyr just barely survived Brandon's final slash, after refusing to yield at the first dozen wounds he obtained. Hoster allowed Petyr to recover just enough so he could be removed from Riverrun and return home to the Fingers in the Vale. Catelyn was forbidden to visit him, but Lysa helped care for him. While in her care, Petyr would once again sleep with Lysa before getting the boot after his time was up. It was no place for a ward of low birth to disrupt the important marriage betrothal. Petyr was bold for trying, but this isn't where his strengths lie. He learned that on this painful day. Swordfighting will never be the way he gets what he wants.
That's their game. Their rules. I'm not going to fight them. I'm going to fuck them. That's what I know. That's what I am.
Petyr left, but not before leaving one last problem for Hoster to deal with. That last encounter with Lysa got her pregnant. At one point in time, she was planned to be Jaime Lannister's wife, but him joining the Kingsguard at a young age ruined that. But Hoster had ambitious betrothals for his daughters. Lysa could never marry someone like Littlefinger of House Baelish, so he made her drink something called moon tea to abort the unborn child. Catelyn would never marry Brandon Stark since the Mad King had him executed. Instead, the next in line to Winterfell would have her hand, Ned. It would be a double marriage between them, as well as Lysa and Jon Arryn. He was far older than Lysa, but a very powerful ally, and not many nobles would want a bride who lost her maidenhood. After Brandon Stark's death, Petyr would write a letter to Catelyn from his home on the Fingers. Cat would never open it, deciding to throw it into a fire since she was now betrothed to Ned, and Petyr caused enough trouble for her family. Even after Lysa's marriage to Jon Arryn, he kept in contact with her. She was able to convince Jon to give Petyr control over all of Gulltown's customs in the Vale, a pretty serious position considering Gulltown is the main port of the entire Kingdom of the Vale, as well as being the 4th largest city in Westeros. Petyr performed so well that he was bringing in 10 times more money for the port. His achievements impressed Jon Arryn enough to send for Petyr to join himself and Lysa in King's Landing to work for the crown. Jon Arryn was Robert Baratheon's hand of the king, and since Robert was so incompetent, Jon had to do all the real ruling. So Petyr had a friend in a very high position. After just 3 years in King's Landing, he was named the King's Master of Coin and had a seat on the small council. He could now make his move with the power he was given. He grew wealthy, owning property and having enough influence to bring some of his own people around him. But Petyr had bigger ambitions. He slowly began to attack the realm from within by by making complex loans for all of Robert's childish spending habits. The debts the crown owned were becoming serious, but with the Seven Kingdoms united, there was little anyone can do, so Petyr changed that. Jon Arryn and Lysa had a young son that the Hand wanted to foster away to Stannis Baratheon. The unstable Lysa would not let her son go, so was easily convinced to kill her own husband. Petyr provided the poison and set the Starks up to fight the Lannisters. With all this chaos, he could rise even further. And he would. After his service to the Lannisters saved them against Stannis' attack on King's Landing, he was rewarded by given the title of Lord Paramount of the Trident and given the largest castle in Westeros, Harrenhal, rising him to the status of Great Lord. This makes him the ruler of the Riverlands, but he never even bothered to step foot in Harrenhal, which has been in half ruin for hundreds of years. Instead, he aims higher, for the Eyrie and the Vale, never settling for having control over the Vale and the Riverlands, where he was born and where he became Littlefinger. The end of his amazing story arc was cut short in Game of Thrones, like many other characters. It seemed like the writers just wanted the series to be over, so started killing major players off left and right, without considering if their conclusions were justifiable. Let's hope his throat isn't just unsatisfyingly slit in the books. I'm not giving up on wanting him to sit on the Iron Throne. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed this character profile, and I'll see y'all soon.